Welcome to Chapter 53, Ecosystems and Global Ecology. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to discuss how energy flows in a food web from producers to consumers to decomposers. You should be able to describe the factors that limit the productivity in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. You should be able to describe the major reservoirs of the nutrient cycles and the processes that move elements from one reservoir to another. You should be able to explain how humans are altering the nutrient and water cycles. And you should be able to explain how the burning of fossil fuels has led to rapid global warming. And also describe several ways that climate change affects organisms, including examples. All right, so to review, an ecosystem is defined as the multiple communities of organisms that live in an area along with the abiotic components like soil, climate, water, and temperature. So we are constantly messing with ecosystems. We take species out of one place and put them somewhere else. We change landscapes so we can live there or not get flooded or whatever. We will add nutrients, usually accidentally, to ecosystems. So some of our impacts include acid rain, nitrate pollution, declining freshwater supplies, meaning we're using up the fresh water, soil erosion, and global climate change. And as I've mentioned earlier, we are making such a big impact on the Earth that many scientists have decided that this epoch that we're currently living in should be named the Anthropocene. Okay, so the first question we're going to address is how energy flows through ecosystems. All right, so does anyone remember what a primary producer is?
Yeah, a primary producer is like a plant or something or an algae that's like making the food for everybody else.
All right, good job, Bird. All right, so we use a specific definition, but it basically means that. So it's the total amount of chemical energy produced by primary producers in a given area and time, and that is called the gross primary productivity, okay? So the gross primary productivity is the total amount of chemical energy that your algae or your plants or whatever in a particular spot are making. And so the gross primary productivity is being used by the primary producers, right? So the primary producers are undergoing photosynthesis, right? And so they're taking that energy from the sun and locking it up in glucose, but they need that glucose to be able to power their own cellular reactions, okay? So part of the energy from photosynthesis goes into allowing the plant to survive using cellular respiration, okay? So that is abbreviated as R for respiration. The rest of the energy that's not used up in respiration can be put into making the plant bigger and making more plants, okay? So does anyone recall, so if you have gross income versus net income, what that is?
Are you kidding me? I'm a dog. I don't earn any money.
Does anyone know?
Well, I mean, I'm just a bird, but I kind of know what that means. So the gross income would be like the total amount of money, and the net income is the part that you actually get to use minus taxes.
Yeah. So net is kind of like, so gross is the total amount of productivity that the plants make, and then the net is the amount left over after the plants take away the amount of productivity that they need to be able to power themselves, okay? So net primary productivity is the gross primary productivity minus the amount of productivity the plants need in order to undergo cellular respiration. So net primary productivity, or NPP, is going to result in biomass, meaning just all of the organic material that is available for all the non-photosynthetic organisms to eat, right? So it's all of the plant bodies. And so when we talk about net primary productivity, or NPP, that is basically an amount that represents the total energy available to consumers and decomposers for them to be able to use. All right, so let's start at the top and look at how efficient autotrophs are at capturing solar energy. So the reality is that plants capture only 0.8% of sunlight.
80%?
No, not 80%.
8%?
No, not 8%.
Less than 8%?
Yes, 0.8%. Okay? So plants are actually less efficient at capturing solar energy than, solar panels you might have on the side of your house. They capture 20% of light. So let's look here at this kind of schematic. So imagine the sun is shining on your little plant here. So the total incoming solar energy that's hitting this plant is 1,254,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year. Okay. So the gross primary productivity is 10,400 kilocalories per meter squared per year. And so that's 8% of the total solar energy goes into gross primary productivity. And then of that gross primary productivity that the plant is actually taking on, some of that energy is being used in cellular respiration. And you remember one of the byproducts of cellular respiration is heat, which is lost into the environment and kind of goes into the vacuum of space. Okay, so cellular respiration, and as well as the heat and waste generated by that, represents 55% of the gross primary productivity that the plant is taking in. And so that leaves 45% of the gross primary productivity towards net primary productivity. Okay, so the sun shines this much, right? The plant only receives this much, and then half of that goes to cellular respiration, and then the other half is put into making more plants. Okay. So yeah, only 45% of GPP is used to produce new biomass. Why are plants so inefficient? A couple of reasons. The first one is that photopigments, do you remember photopigments?
Yeah, like chlorophyll A and B.
Yeah. So photopigments can't absorb all of the wavelengths of light that are shining on the plant. All of the other wavelengths of light are basically lost or useless to the plant. Other things, so the rate at which a plant can undergo photosynthesis is going to be reduced in the winter or when it's very dry. So you remember, when it's very dry, plants will frequently close their stomata and stop undergoing cellular respiration because opening their stomata causes them to lose too much moisture. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that the enzymes in plants, as well as in us and everything else, are temperature dependent. So enzymes work best at a particular temperature. They can't work best at all of the possible temperatures. So whenever the temperature deviates from the plant's ideal conditions, the energy efficiency or the efficiency of enzymes is going to be less, and so the cellular reactions are going to happen with much less efficiency in the plant. All right, so let's look at the energy flow model for ecosystems. So energy is going to move through organisms in the form of biomass. Okay, so you have the sun and it's shining on a primary producer like a plant or an algae, right? So the primary producer is then going to get eaten by a primary consumer, which is then going to get eaten by a secondary consumer and maybe even eaten by a tertiary consumer. Okay, so the nutrients locked up in the plant are going to get passed from the primary producer to the primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer. All of these organisms will die at some point, and then they will kind of return to the ground where they will feed a decomposer. Okay, so that is the flow of the nutrients. Okay, so the nutrients don't leave the system, they all stay on Earth and they just cycle around. All right, this is different than the pathway that energy takes. So energy is coming from the sun, right? And the primary producer is undergoing photosynthesis to make it into sugars, and then the primary producer is undergoing cellular respiration to power its cells, and so some of the energy is lost as heat. The primary consumer is eating the plant and undergoing cellular respiration, loses energy as heat. Same with the secondary consumer and the tertiary consumer and even the decomposer. So you can think of nutrient cycling as a closed system, which is different than the energy cycling, which is kind of an open system, right? It's kind of leaky. The sun is shining a lot on the primary producer, and then energy is being lost at each stage of transition. All right, I believe I said these things. Maybe I didn't define a decomposer detritivore. Decomposer feeds on detritus, which is the name for organic material that is on the ground. So it's waste products, it could be poop, it could be a dead animal, something like that. When you have organisms that obtain energy from the same type of source that are at the same level, or we would say that they occupy the same trophic level. So you have grass and you have lots of primary consumers, right? You could have grasshoppers, you could have cows, right? Those are all primary consumers. So we'd say they're at the same trophic level. Okay, so this is reiterating what I just said. Energy flows when one organism eats another, and energy is constantly being lost as heat. However, the nutrients will continue to cycle without any loss. All right, so about what percent of the energy from sunlight is converted into gross primary production?
It wasn't 80%.
No, it wasn't 80%.
It wasn't 8%.
It wasn't 8%. What was it?
0.8%.
Yep.
I hate to see that. It seems very wasteful.
Well, that's just how it is. Okay, so let's talk about trophic structure. So we will talk about food chains a little bit. So those are the possible pathways that energy flows between the different trophic levels in an ecosystem. And you can have a bunch of different food chains in the same ecosystem. So for example, you can have a grazing food chain where you have live maple leaves that get fed upon by, well, your book says a cricket, okay, which gets eaten by a robin, which gets eaten by a Cooper's hawk. I would point out at this point that crickets do not eat live maple leaves. Crickets are detritivores. This should be a grasshopper. I think in some of the pictures I fixed it. There we go. It's a grasshopper. A grasshopper eats live maple leaves. Man, book, get it straight. This is a decomposer food chain. So, for example, if you have a dried maple leaf, then you have bacteria and archaea that are feeding on the decomposing maple leaf, and then the earthworm is eating the bacteria and archaea, the robin eats the earthworm, and the Cooper's hawk eats the robin. Okay, so these are just different kinds of food chains. Within each food chain, you have a primary producer, the live or dead leaves, the primary either decomposer or consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and quaternary consumer. And you should note that consumers can participate in more than one food chain. So for example, the Cooper's hawk is in both chains. Also, consumers can feed at multiple trophic levels. So for example, you might have the Cooper's hawk eat the robin and the grasshopper, right? All right. We don't usually just show simple food chains because food chains tend to be embedded in more complex food webs. So, for example, maggots and bacteria are going to eat dead animals, and they are each participating in a different pathway, right? And so we will just use these food webs as a nice compact way to summarize the flow of energy and document the different kinds of trophic interactions that happen in ecosystems. Oh yeah, again, they keep saying that crickets eat live leaves. No, they don't. I fixed it. Thank you. All right, let's talk about the amount of energy that is transferred between each of the trophic levels, right? So I already told you that energy transfer is kind of leaky, and every time something eats something else, it gets some of the energy and some of the energy is lost, okay? So we know that the amount of biomass produced at each trophic level is going to be less than the amount at the previous trophic level. And we know that most of the energy that each of the consumers are using is used for cellular respiration, right? Making the ATP to make our cells work. So there's only a little bit left over for growth and reproduction. So you end up with this pyramid of productivity. So for example, let's say we start out with leaves. Here I've already fixed it for you. It's a grasshopper. Let's say the primary producers are producing 1,000 grams per meter squared per year. Okay. Then the primary consumers and decomposers will eat the primary producers, right? All right. And so in the primary consumers and decomposers, this amount, 1,000 grams per milliliter, 1,000 grams per meter squared per year of leaf only makes 100 grams per meter squared per year of grasshopper, okay? And then the birds eat the grasshopper, and so that 100 grams per meter squared per year is only, made into 10 grams per meter squared per year of bird, and then the tertiary consumer is eating the secondary consumer, and so that is being made into only 1 gram per meter squared per year of hawk, okay? So at each stage, only 10% of the biomass is transferred to the next level. So there's only 10% energy efficiency. So if you go from the bottom, where you started out with 1,000 grams per meter squared per year of leaf, that is only made into 1 gram per meter squared per year. 90%, so only 10% of the energy is transferred at each level, okay? And the other 90% is used for cellular respiration, or is not used or is excreted. When we're talking about productivity, it's important to note that this is a rate, so grams per meter squared per year. It represents the amount of biomass produced per unit per area per year. We can talk about efficiency too, which is a ratio. It's the fraction of biomass transferred from one trophic level to the next trophic level. And as I just said, efficiency of biomass transfer between trophic levels tends to be around only 10%. Okay? All right, so how many kilograms of carnivore, which is a secondary consumer, biomass can be supported by a field plot containing 500 grams of plant material?
Oh, okay.
So 500 grams of plants. Maybe we should all draw a little picture. I don't really have a way of drawing it here. So what's at the bottom of this pyramid?
500 kilograms of plants.
Okay, so what's the plant?
It's a primary producer, I guess.
Okay, so what eats a primary producer?
Primary consumer.
Yeah, so you have a primary consumer. Okay, and then what eats a primary consumer?
Secondary consumer.
Okay, so secondary consumer, right? So we have primary producer at the bottom, and then primary consumer, and then secondary consumer. So how many times is energy transferred?
Twice.
Yeah, twice, right? So if 10% of the energy is transferred at each level, if you start out with 500 kilograms of plant material in the primary producer, how much is transferred to the primary consumer?
50.
Yeah, and how many is transferred to the secondary consumer?
5.
There we go. Okay, we're going to talk about kind of a similar looking pyramid with a completely opposite result, okay? So there is a phenomenon called biomagnification, and this represents the fact that some molecules will actually increase in concentration at higher levels in the food chain. So that's biomagnification. Only particular kinds of molecules do this, and that would be molecules that don't break down quickly and can't be digested or excreted by organisms. So for example, if an organism eats a heavy metal like mercury or persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, or POPs, then the organism just basically has that substance in their body their entire lives. And if something eats them, then that organism that ate them will have it in their body, right? So the grasshopper or whatever can't poop out these metals. They just stay in their body. So if you have, let's just say that somebody is spraying DDT, which is a pesticide which is used to control mosquitoes, right? So DDT is sprayed maybe on the grass, right? Okay. And so it's in the grass, and it's sprayed at a fairly low concentration. So it's sprayed at a level of 2 nanograms per gram lipid, okay? And then primary consumers, maybe, or primary decomposers, come over and eat the grass. We'll say it's a primary consumer, right? A cricket, or not a cricket, a grasshopper comes and eats the grass. And so if there's 2 nanograms per gram lipid, it becomes magnified. So let's say in this instance, it becomes magnified so that, this cricket or grasshopper or whatever, depending on what this is that they're eating, will consume, like 20 times, or it'll go and eat. So this is 2 nanograms per gram lipid, and so it'll, eat 10 times this amount of area of grass, but every single one of these particles that it eats ends up staying in its body. So now the grasshopper has a concentration of 20 nanograms per gram lipid of this POP, and then maybe a bird will come eat this grasshopper, and the bird just won't eat this grasshopper, the bird will eat 10 grasshoppers, right? So then the bird accumulates 200 nanograms per gram lipid of DDT, and then a tertiary consumer eats this bird, but he doesn't just eat this bird, he eats 10 birds that have done the same thing, and so then he ends up with a concentration of 2,000 nanograms per gram lipid of DDT. In fact, DDT was banned from the US under most circumstances because it was starting to biomagnify and accumulate in tertiary consumers. So there was kind of a classic case of raptors ending up with very weak eggshells because of the biomagnification of DDT, because they were eating animals that were being exposed to the original low doses of DDT. All right, so just compare and contrast that pollutants will become more concentrated as they move up the food chain, although note that the energy and overall biomass does not become more concentrated. Okay, let's look at this little picture here and try to figure out for ourselves which biomes are the most productive. So if you look at this little graph, what does that tell you about biomes? Which biome is the most productive per unit area? The coral reefs and algal beds. Yeah, they have the longest bar, so they're the most productive per unit area. So which is the most productive aquatic biome? Coral reefs and algal beds. Yeah, the most productive terrestrial biome?
Tropical wet forest.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So which biome covers the greatest surface area on Earth? It's the open ocean. It's so long. Look, it goes all the way off the end of the chart. Yeah. Couldn't even fit it all in here. They had to like splice the x-axis and make it go all the way to 65. All right. So this is total NPP, right? So it's not just looking per unit area what the net primary productivity it's just looking at the entire Earth and determining the productivity of each area in the entire Earth. So, which biome is the most productive? Well, it's still the open ocean, I guess. Still? Oh no, actually, yeah, look how little the bar is for the coral reefs and algal beds. Yeah. So, the open ocean has the highest NPP in water. Yeah, what about on land?
Still tropical wet forest.
Okay. So we should note that tropical wet and tropical dry forests cover less than 5% of the surface of the Earth. But if you add up tropical wet forest and, where are we? Tropical dry forest, over here. Okay. They will account for over 30% of the total NPP on land. We should also, in looking at the ocean, see that the NPP in the open ocean is very low. So if you just were to take, like a meter squared of open ocean, you would find it had very low productivity, but there's so much ocean that the total NPP of the ocean is the highest for any of the ecosystems, or any of the aquatic biomes. All right, so how much of the Earth's total NPP are humans using? So one way that we want to think about this is to assess how much NPP humans are removing to figure out potential NPP, okay? So that's our estimate of what the NPP that would be on Earth if there were not humans here to use it. So we currently estimate that humans either prevent or appropriate 24% of potential NPP.
What do you mean by prevents?
Well, they put like a parking lot up or something like that, and then plants can't grow. So it's like they're not using the NPP, but they're doing something that keeps it from growing.
Oh.
So if we look at that 24% of potential NPP that humans are messing with, 53% is harvested and used, so that would be things like crops. 40% is prevented through land use change, so that's like parking lots or apartment buildings or whatever, airports or whatever. 7% is destroyed by human-induced fires. So, yeah, I mean, there are naturally occurring fire regimes, but there are also fires that are accidentally facilitated by things that humans do. Okay, let's talk about nutrient cycling.
Oh boy, this is my favorite part.
It is? Well, I'm glad somebody's excited about nutrient cycling. All right, so we talked about it already, that nutrients are engaged in a cycle, right, where they are just kind of moving from one form to another on the Earth. We don't really gain or lose any of them. So they start out, for example, in the soil, and then those are taken up by plants, and that's assimilated into the body of the plant. The plant is consumed by an herbivore. The giraffe will go on and live its life, and it'll poop, which will put some of the nutrients back into the soil, and eventually it will die. And both the poop and the dead giraffe will become detritus that will be consumed by a decomposer. And then the decomposer will decompose, and the decomposed material will be taken up by this plant, right? Similarly, the plant itself will die, and when the plant dies, it will become detritus, which will decompose. All right, so primary decomposers and also the carbon-containing compounds they release will make what we call soil organic matter. So some of the material in soil is like minerals and stuff, right? But the rest of it is soil organic matter. So it's living. It's once living material that is in the process of decomposing. When it has become completely decayed, it is called humus. And then eventually the nutrients are converted to inorganic forms that can be taken up by plants. So they'll be broken down into their individual ions, and then the plants will suck up the ions. There are a variety of factors that control how fast nutrients can cycle through a particular biome. So in a boreal forest, if you take a section of the soil, so this is a cross section of boreal forest soil, the upper soil is going to be partially made of partially decomposed detritus and organic matter. So you have this really thick layer on the top of organic matter. And so you can tell it's decomposing very slowly to have built up this much organic matter. So what is it about boreal forests that limits the ability of decomposers to decompose?
They're just bored.
Well, no, that's totally, no. What is it about a boreal forest that defines the characteristics, or what are the defining characteristics of the boreal forest?
Well, it's cold.
Is that your car alarm, dog?
Yes, I left my jalopy outside.
All right, you can go turn that off.
No, I think we can just leave it go.
Great, okay. I didn't even know anyone still had car alarms.
I do.
Okay. Dogs still have car alarms. So tell me about a boreal forest.
Well, it's pretty cold.
Yeah, it's pretty cold, right? So do you think that's likely to affect decomposers?
Yeah, like all of their chemical reactions will have to proceed pretty slow. And it's like the ground's frozen some of the year, so then they just won't do anything.
Yeah, so that probably matters, right?
Yeah.
All right, so because it is cold, it tends to limit the metabolic rate of decomposers, so you end up with this buildup of organic matter. So there's more organic matter than the decomposers can handle, and so you get this kind of layer at the top. All right, if you contrast that to a tropical wet forest, if you dig down a little bit, the organic matter layer at the top is really skinny, okay? And that's because the conditions are very favorable for decomposers. So decomposers are able to decompose everything immediately, and so there's almost no organic accumulation at the top of the soil. So you would expect that in a boreal forest, nutrients are cycling very slowly, and in a tropical wet forest, nutrients are cycling very quickly. One thing that you might notice is that in a tropical forest, right? Well, in a boreal forest, you have a lot of organic matter that's locked up in this decomposing layer, right? So a lot of decomposing material, less on the surface. However, in a tropical forest, very little of the organic matter is locked up here. The rest of it is available. So most of the biomass in a tropical forest is alive. All right, so I mentioned before that humans can have large effects on nutrient cycling. So let's look at an example of a research project that asked, how does the presence of vegetation affect the rate of nutrient export in a temperate forest ecosystem? So the author's hypothesis is that the presence of the vegetation lowers the rate of nutrient export because it increases soil stability, meaning it keeps the soil in place so the soil doesn't wash away, and it increases the recycling of nutrients, okay? So, and then the null hypothesis is that the presence of vegetation has no effect on the rate of nutrient export. So what they did is they took two different watersheds.
What's a watershed?
A watershed is an area that empties into a body of a watershed is an area of land that empties into a body of water. Okay. Oh, here it says area drained by a single stream. So in this case, it's a stream. This is the body of water. And so what they did is they quantified nutrient levels in the soil, in the plants, and in the streams. And they had two watersheds, a control one and a devegetated one. Okay. And they monitored the amount of dissolved substances that ended up at the bottom in the stream. So they predicted that the amount of dissolved substances in streams in the devegetated watershed would be much higher than the amount of dissolved substances in the streams in the control watershed. The prediction of the null hypothesis is that you wouldn't find a difference.
Wait, why would you even do this experiment? Because it seems like the answer's obvious.
Well, I mean, I think they were actually probably measuring a lot more subtle variables than this, not just whether or not you ended up with more nutrient cycling. But for our sake, we can just look at the kind of most general message because we don't know enough of the details to know their exact, to be able to understand their exact results. All right, so this is what they found. The net dissolved substances in the streams in the devegetated area was 10 times higher in the devegetated site versus a control site. So we can clearly see that the presence of vegetation limits nutrient export. And if you take the vegetation away, you're going to end up with a lot more nutrient export from the system. And so we can see just mechanically that the plant roots aren't holding all of the soil in place, right? And all, in the soil particles, that's where all of the ions are, right? And without the plant roots, the soil eroded and washed all of the ions back down into the water. The plant roots were not there to take up the recycled materials, and all of this material was washed out of the ecosystem. One thing that should be noted, so remember we talked about primary and secondary succession, right? Once you lose soil, it can take a very long time to get it back, okay? All right, now we're going to go run through some water cycles, okay? So...
Yeah, I love water cycles.
Okay, good. So let's see. The major reservoir for water is the ocean. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, I knew that.
Okay, good. I'm glad you knew that. So 97.5% of the water on Earth is in the ocean. So there is 437 kilometers cubed per year of water that's being evaporated from the ocean. Some of it just gets rained back down into the ocean. Some of it gets kind of blown over the land by water vapor, gets blown over the land as water vapor, and then it precipitates over the land. There's also evaporation that's coming up from the plants and transpiration. Do you remember what transpiration is?
Yeah, that's when the water's going out of the stomata.
Yeah. Okay. Some things, and then after the water lands on the land, it runs down through surface runoff into rivers and then lakes and then eventually the ocean. Okay, so 61 kilometers cubed per year goes off the surface of the land into the water, but you should know that a lot of it is subsurface runoff. So some of that goes into lakes or just directly into the ground. It percolates through the soil into these kind of water storage areas underneath the land. So some of them we can kind of drill down through the soil and access those. Those are open aquifers. So the water is just going directly through the soil into the open aquifers. Some of them, however, are closed aquifers, and there's kind of a stone shelf here, and the water is underneath that. And so, let me see. Yeah. I just remember reading a weird story about a guy out fishing on a lake, and then suddenly the lake just water started going down and down and down and down and down until he was just sitting in a boat on top of a muddy field filled with dying fish. And basically what happened is something caused a puncture in the roof of a closed aquifer, and all the water went from the open aquifer where he was in his lake down into the closed aquifer. I guess it's lucky he wasn't near the hole. That would be a terrible way to die. All right, which moves more water, evaporation or precipitation?
This is a good question. I wish I knew how to do math.
Well, just look about at the ocean one, right? Because it's much larger.
It's bigger, more evaporation than precipitation on the water.
Yeah?
And more precipitation than evaporation on land.
Yeah. Which moves more water, precipitation over land or water?
Over water.
Yeah. Where is there more? What is greater, surface runoff or subsurface runoff?
Surface runoff.
All right. So only about 0.5% of the water on Earth is available in lakes, rivers, and in groundwater for drinking. Obviously, we can't drink ocean water. Most of the groundwater is in aquifers. And so, like I just mentioned, those are these layers of porous rock, sand, or gravel that are saturated with water. There are open aquifers that are open to water from the surface, and then closed aquifers are under non-porous rock layers. So it can take thousands of years to fill up a closed aquifer, so if we tap into one and use the water, it'll be a very long time before it can refill. We do things that affect groundwater, so when we pave, it reduces the ability of the water to get down into the aquifers. When we take land that used to be a forest and make it into an agricultural field, then the root systems from the trees that held onto the water are lost, and as a result, instead of the water going down through the soil into the groundwater, a lot of the water will go over the surface and into streams. Also, we have practices like irrigating crops and, taking showers and dishes and stuff, and industrial use like fracking, which use lots and lots and lots of groundwater. So this is a picture of the global water table, okay? So the water table is the upper limit of saturated soil. So if you think about what the water table is, think about if you were to dig, how long would it take you to get to water, okay? So we can see here that, well, this isn't a picture of every continent, but I just tell you, the water table is dropping on every continent. So we can see here just kind of a cross-section in the US, Wyoming down through Texas, that only very small areas are actually recharging and water is going down to them. The rest of the areas, you have to dig deeper and deeper and deeper in order to actually get to water. We know that humans have grown beyond our carrying capacity for water.
Wait a minute. Carrying capacity is the maximum amount of individuals can live in an area. That sounds terrible.
Yeah, it is kind of terrible. We have been doing things like mining water from aquifers, which of course creates, kind of ground instability, and it takes the aquifers a really long time to refill. We don't have that kind of time. 40% of the population of Earth has insufficient water resources. I guess we're very fortunate in Ohio that we're in an area that is not have too much problem with water, but pretty much most other places are having problems getting enough fresh water. There is a movement to desalinate salt water, but it's incredibly energy expensive to be able to desalinate water. And also the desalination process creates pollution. So this isn't a great solution either. All right, on from water to nitrogen. So remember we talked a little bit about how nitrogen has to be in a form that is reduced or fixed to be added to ecosystems. So plants are not able to use it in its atmospheric form. It has to be able to be fixed by fungi or bacteria into the ions that plants need to be able to take it up. All right, so most of the molecular nitrogen, N2, in the atmosphere is not available to plants. Plants can only use ammonium, NH4 plus, or nitrate, NO3 minus. Okay. So yeah, you end up getting nitrogen fixation from lightning-driven reactions in the atmosphere, and also from bacteria and stuff like that. So nitrogen in the ocean or the aquatic reservoir, there are 8,000 grams, 10 to the 12th grams of nitrogen per year. Okay, that are in the ocean. Inland, the reservoir would be kind of in the trees, right? And the other plants and things like that. So terrestrial organisms are hanging on to other nitrogen, and then they die, right? And then the nitrogen gets assimilated into the ground, and it can become, ions again. These ions can be taken up by new organisms, so that's a thing that happens. You also have kind of interplay between the reservoir, the major reservoir of nitrogen, which is the atmosphere, okay? So that's the biggest source of nitrogen, obviously. And so that nitrogen, it can stay in the atmosphere, it can get fixed, meaning put into a form that can be used by plants by nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria in the water. It can get fixed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria in roots and soil. So either we can do this naturally in, ecosystems. This can be done by crop plants. Other kinds of weirdness here that gets the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and into a form that can be used. Lightning, apparently, can take atmospheric nitrogen and make it usable by plants. And then finally, we will produce fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizer, and so that adds nitrogen to the kind of ecosystems, and also we will burn fossil fuels as well. And then finally, should point out that a lot of the decomposing materials here, the nitrogen gets back into the atmosphere because you have bacteria in mud that use these substances and then excrete atmospheric, or N2, back into the atmosphere. So that's kind of the major cycle. So most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere, other reservoirs in water and in living organisms, and then most of the cycling we've kind of talked about already. All right, we do things that alters the nitrogen cycle, and so we will cultivate crops that harbor nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So things like lentils and beans and peas, right? All of those harbor nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So that pulls more nitrogen from the atmosphere into plants. We produce fertilizers by, kind of industrial processes, and then we burn fossil fuels, which releases nitric oxide. Kind of you would think that just adding nitrogen to terrestrial ecosystems would increase the productivity of the ecosystem, and that would be good. But if you put too much nitrogen in an ecosystem, you get negative effects. You can get algal blooms in aquatic ecosystems, leading to these oxygen-free dead zones. So people will use nitrogen in a farmer's field, and it'll wash into the, lakes nearby. And then the algae will suddenly kind of breed explosively and use up all the oxygen. So what you find in lab experiments, you can basically replicate this effect. So if you add nitrogen, you get increased productivity immediately, but then over long periods of time, you end up with decreased species diversity. So you end up with this kind of feeding frenzy for the nitrogen, and then one of the organisms will survive and then overproduce and then, cause problems. And so you end up at the end of this supplementation with decreased species diversity. We also know that nitrogen pollution from burning fossil fuels will cause a lot of really bad things to happen, like acid rain. It's contributing to climate change and also depleting the ozone layer, which is kind of protecting us from rays of sun, from space. All right, let's talk about carbon. So the major reservoir for carbon is the ocean, okay? We talked about this a little bit. So carbon gets kind of locked up in the exoskeletons of sea creatures, which falls to the bottom of the ocean and hangs out there, right? Let's see. There is some carbon reservoir in the atmosphere, and so this is kind of an important reservoir because the organisms in the ocean kind of lock up a lot of this carbon, but the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a little bit more mobile, so it can go in and out of different kinds of systems very quickly. We also have a reservoir of carbon on Earth, so everything that's alive, plus that top layer of the soil, that is made of organic material. All right, so photosynthesis, right, is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into living organisms, both on land and in the water. And then cellular respiration is putting out carbon dioxide, both on land and in the water. We are also doing things here as people. So we are changing the land by deforesting it, which is potentially adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that would have normally been used by a plant. And we're using fossil fuels that contribute to this reservoir of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All right, I don't have a picture of the global phosphorus cycle, but there is one. It basically tracks the movement of phosphorus among terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And so the crust of the Earth is the main place where phosphorus is, and then as the rocks weather, the phosphorus gets released from those rocks and is available for other organisms. Some of the things that we do, like mining and creating fertilizer, increase the amount of phosphorus in the global geochemical cycle. And so you can also cause eutrophication, meaning like an overproduction of algae and green kind of stuff in lakes, And so that's a problem that's caused by too much phosphorus. All right, so do you guys remember what's the difference between climate and weather?
Well, if I see a rock, I'm gonna climb it.
No, that's not climate.
No? Okay, fine. Like, weather is short term and climate is long term.
Yeah, so give me an example of weather.
It's raining.
All right, give me an example of climate.
It's usually freezing in the winter here.
Okay, that's about right. So we should remember that weather and climate are not the same thing. So weather is short-term and highly variable, right? So it's what the atmosphere looks like at a very particular place in time. So it could be what's the temperature, what's the moisture, what's the sunlight, how much wind is there here. Climate refers to long-term patterns of regional and global weather. So you often hear different terms used, right? Global warming versus global climate change. Global warming is just referring to the increase in the average temperature of the planet versus global climate change, which refers to the sum of all the changes in local temperature and precipitation patterns that are caused by global warming. We tend to talk more about global climate change than global warming because, sometimes the changes caused by warming in one place cause a decrease in temperature somewhere else, at least temporarily. And so global climate change is more encompassing to be able to refer to all of the effects that we're talking about. All right, what causes global climate change? Well, we talked about carbon dioxide earlier in the course. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, right? And by greenhouse gas, that means that it is a gas that allows us to trap heat radiated from Earth and keep it from being lost into space, okay? So the sun shines on the Earth, and then you have various so if we didn't have any greenhouse gases, then all of the heat would just bounce right back into space. But because of the greenhouse gases, the Earth acts kind of like a greenhouse where the glass bounces some of the heat back into the building and keeps it warm. Okay. And, like the greenhouse effect is what allowed life on Earth to exist, right? However, things may have been going a little bit crazy with the amount of greenhouse gases that we currently have on Earth. So it is totally normal for average temperature and local weather patterns to kind of go up and down a bit, like no question about that. But the thing that we're actually noticing is that the rate of this change is unprecedented, and we know it is caused by human activity. So let me show you some of the data on this. So we knew as early as the 1950s that we were releasing lots and lots of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And in the 1950s, people thought, well, it'll be okay because the ocean is huge and it would absorb all of the excess carbon dioxide. But the problem is, because of different kind of complex chemical issues, the ocean is limited in how much carbon dioxide it can actually take in. So like I mentioned, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and so it keeps heat that's being radiated from the surface of the Earth from being lost into the vacuum of space. That causes a greenhouse effect. So like I said, the greenhouse effect itself is natural, and the Earth did have a greenhouse effect before humans ever showed up. So I do not believe that anyone is arguing that humans are causing the greenhouse effect. Instead, we are altering the amount of chemicals and kind of increasing the greenhouse effect, okay? So the greenhouse effect, is caused by gases like carbon dioxide, but also methane, water vapor, and nitrous oxide. All right, so what we can see here is that there is a gradual increase from the time, so this is data from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. There's a kind of data collecting station. So we can see if we look from like 1980 up until 2015, this is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's gradually increasing. It doesn't seem to be slowing or going down at all, even though we are trying very hard to decrease our carbon emissions. There's also, this is the temperature change, there's a clear increase in the average temperature. And people make arguments like that this increase is due to, like, I don't know, other factors, like, for example, fluctuations in solar energy. I don't know if you've ever heard that argument.
I have never heard that argument.
Okay. Well, dog, some people have argued that the Earth isn't getting warmer, we're just kind of in a pattern caused by, like, fluctuations in solar energy. But this is just showing you that these are actually representing the fluctuations in solar energy. And so they're going up and down and up and down and up and down. However, the temperature of the Earth is just going up, okay? So the solar energy fluctuations cannot account for this change in temperature over time. All right, so why is the climate changing so rapidly? Let's take a look at this picture here showing population size, okay? So which countries have the largest population size?
China and India.
Yeah.
And then the US.
And then the US. Which countries have the largest per capita carbon dioxide emissions?
Australia and the US and Canada.
Yeah. So which countries have the largest total carbon dioxide emissions?
China and the US.
Yeah. Okay. So what this is showing is, so China has a lot of people in it. Each person is producing carbon dioxide, but not so much. Per person, there's just a lot of people there. The US, there's not so many people there, but we are using a lot of carbon dioxide per person. So cumulatively, we're actually generating a lot of carbon dioxide. Should note that the human population has exploded in size, as we've talked about before when we were talking about life tables. And the average per capita use of fossil fuel has skyrocketed, especially in industrial countries. And so even though in the US we represent less than 5% of the population of the world, we produce 1/6 of the global carbon dioxide emissions. So we have quite a way to go in it to improve this. All right, so if we continue to produce the very high emissions of greenhouse gases, what change do we expect to see in temperature in 100 years, 200 years, and 300 years? All right, so which line is the very high one?
That's the one on top.
Okay.
It's red. I can't see color.
Okay, well, it's this top line. So in 100 years, what will be the change in temperature?
Draw the line.
Okay, here.
4.
4 degrees Celsius?
Yeah.
All right, what about 200 years?
6.5 degrees Celsius.
All right, 300 years?
7 degrees Celsius.
All right, if we are able to dramatically reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, what will be the change in 100, 200, or 300 years? What about 100?
Like 3/4 of a degree.
All right, 200?
Half a degree.
300?
Half a degree.
Okay. So this graph came from an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and this is from their 2014 report. Their average global temperature increased 0.85 degrees Celsius, or 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, between 1880 and 2012. So this is double the increase that occurred in the 19th century. So there is a dramatic increase. So this is representing the average temperature change. So millions of years ago, warm, kind of went down. some severe fluctuations with the ice ages, and then it's increased, right? So you can see the scale is all over the place, but whatever. And this is where we are right now. All right, so the models suggest that the global temperature will increase between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, and between 0.5 and 7 degrees Celsius by 2300, right? So we have quite a wide range here. And so even under the most conservative scenario, right, this 0.5 or 1.5, the average temperature over the next 300 years is going to be higher than it has ever been over the past 5 million years. And if we don't do something to be able to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're producing, it could be extremely severe. All right, so what is the effect of climate change on the water cycle? So if the temperature rises, that is going to affect when, where, and how much water is going to fall as precipitation, as well as how much is going to evaporate. So this is showing percentage change in soil moisture between 2000 and what we're predicting in 2100. Okay, so red is losing moisture and blue is it's gaining moisture. So you can see over much of the U.S., the soil is going to be losing moisture. So if we wish to still produce agricultural crops, that is bad for us. So the drier areas are going to have reduced primary productivity and increased risk of fire as well. You can see a couple areas over here and here may actually get a little bit more moisture. But the other thing to note is that precipitation is also going to become more variable. So even if they're getting, on average, more water, they may not be getting water when they need it in order to grow what they need to grow. Also in the drier areas, you might get, like, for example, in California, you get all of your yearly water within a really short window of time, and that might not be enough for a good growing season. So let's talk a little bit about phenology. So that is the fancy name for the timing of seasonal events, okay? So phenology would be like, oh, it's the time of year when all of the buds form in the ground, right? That kind of a thing. And so as these different seasonal cues shift, meaning like, you know, if you have a plant and over a certain temperature it'll bloom, then organisms are also going to shift their biological activities to match this cue, okay? So if it becomes warmer and warmer, some organisms will, you know, kind of grow earlier and earlier in the year. Other organisms, though, have other cues that can't really change. So one example would be a snowshoe hare, and their cue is daylight length. And so this, you know, when the days are over a certain length, it causes them to change their coat color from white to brown in the spring. But because the snow is melting earlier and earlier, they are kind of stuck like this, a white hare in a dark background, because, I mean, this is just the physiological cue that their body uses to determine when to change, you know, when to shed out their white coat and grow a brown coat. But, I mean, because of global climate change, it is becoming warm earlier. So that's bad. So that's a phenology shift. And in some populations, because of the changes in climate and also different new and different species interactions, allele frequencies are changing. So there used to be more variation in ladybug or ladybird beetle morphs, but now we see fewer and fewer of the dark ones because they tend to kind of overheat and kind of cook themselves, so those tend to disappear. Some species will not be able to, adjust to the change in temperature, and they will die. We've talked about in an earlier lecture that as the ocean becomes more acidic, as the ocean absorbs more carbon dioxide, it becomes more acidic, and that causes a problem for a lot of kinds of animals that have calcium carbonate shells to be able to form shells. And also we skipped this one, but as it becomes warmer, you end up with a shift in biome, and so you end up with organisms that are just going to different places where they can survive, and leaving places where they can no longer survive. So some examples here, combinations of things like changes in climate with like changes in how we use land can cause high extinction rates. So one example with the lizards is that 12% of local lizard populations in Mexico have gone extinct since 1975 because the temperature has increased and they can't live there anymore, and they got nowhere to go. We know that 40% of amphibians face imminent extinction due to numerous threats. So, they're very vulnerable to habitat destruction. Also, they're, they're kind of dependent on the water. So any kind of like human introduction of chemicals is likely to kill amphibians. Further, as temperature increases, the chytrids, that are the fungal, group that tends to infect amphibians, does better, so that the warmer the temperature, the more chytrids, the more infected amphibians. So the ocean can absorb a third of carbon dioxide emissions, and we know that when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. So the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more carbonic acid forms in the ocean, and the more acidic the ocean becomes. And so there are a lot of negative effects of acidity in the ocean. A more acidic ocean affects the ability of larval fish to be able to smell predators. It also affects, how like the ocean is filled with the sperm of 1 billion sea creatures. That sperm may have trouble swimming because of the ocean acidity. And as I just mentioned, as the ocean becomes more acidic, there's less calcium carbonate ions available for things like corals and mollusks to build skeletons out of. On land, NPP is also changing. What does NPP stand for?
Net primary productivity.
Yeah. So from 2000 to 2009, this was the warmest decade on record. I think your book only has the stats up to 2015. I bet it's been warmer still since then. So NPP has increased in some regions, but it decreased globally. So you can see here, NPP, there are some green spots, but if you add up all the green and blue together, total NPP has declined, okay? Now, you might have the expectation that if there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because the plants are using carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, you get more photosynthesis, right? But it doesn't actually end up working out that way. The kind of combined effect of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere that causes drought has caused the plants to have lower NPP, okay? So, you know what I mean. So it's carbon dioxide would increase photosynthesis, but carbon dioxide would make precipitation, due to greenhouse effects, would make precipitation more erratic and cause droughts as well. All right, how is NPP changing in oceans? Well, if the ocean is warmer, it has decreased productivity. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So remember we talked about the fact when we were talking about lake turnover that 4 degrees Celsius is the most dense water is, right? The molecules, the H2Os in the water are the most close together at 4 degrees Celsius, right? At the surface, the water is warm and less dense, and so you end up with nutrient-rich water that is being brought up to the surface by currents, okay? So nutrients fall from the top to the bottom, and then the nutrients are, through the various mechanisms that we already talked about, brought back up to the surface where they can get eaten by stuff. Okay. If you make the surface of the water a lot warmer and a lot less dense, then the nutrients are not able to make it all the way back up to the surface. There's too steep a gradient in the density of water from the bottom to the top, okay? So it used to be the bottom is very dense and the top is less dense, and so the nutrients can kind of wash all the way up to the top. But now the water is so much warmer, the water molecules are so much farther apart, the nutrients can only make it up this high. They can't get up the steep density gradient, so the nutrients aren't making it to the surface. As a result, net primary productivity is decreasing in oceans. So the water in the benthic zone is still nutrient rich, right? So this dense water at the bottom of the oceans is 4 degrees Celsius year round. And then the water coming up from the bottom will rise, right? And so the water is becoming less dense, right? But as I just said, the difference between what the surface of the water used to be in temperature compared to what it is, it's too big of a difference between the surface and the bottom now, and so the nutrients can't get all the way back up to the top. All right, so in this chapter, hopefully you learned about how ecosystems are connected by the flow of energy and nutrients. We talked about how energy flows through ecosystems, and we looked at global patterns in productivity. We thought about how nutrients cycle through ecosystems, including global biochemical cycles, and we looked at how human activities affect global patterns in productivity and geochemical cycles, as well as global climate change.